Economics is great, and I know everything about it. So I guess
it's time to. Where can you start?
Let's talk
about economics. Let's talk about social institutions. We understand everything about that.
Sure. So my book is Why Nations Fail by Robinson and Acemoglu, while your book, I'm trying to find the title, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail by Ray Dalio.
Really likes long titles. You just can't find,
all the words. I can see that.
He's got like 3 different titles.
I already dislike the guy.
He's really trying a little bit too hard, and which is kind of paradoxical. He's already a hedge fund billionaire, but he's just so preoccupied.
He's dropping some mad words on the paper, just like he drops some mad cash onto his investments. So cool, awesome. So Why Nations Fail is essentially a book that's a bit of like a misnomer. The book should be rather called Why Nations Prosper, because when we talk about why nations fail or succeed, we can talk about different things, whether that's military success or economic success or quality of life success. But it's much more straightforward if you talk about why nations prosper, right? Or why nations get out of poverty.
That wouldn't have sold so much because everybody likes bad news, right? Failing versus succeeding.
So failing or why nations fall into poverty is an okay title as well. So whichever way you want to look at it, if you look at it like a little schadenfreude and you like things collapsing and messing up, then that's probably a better one. And I probably like that one too better. So the book itself is basically claiming that a country's success depends on the institutions it has. Its institutions can be inclusive or extractive. Inclusive institution being institutions that allow people to join the economy and politics and benefit from it, while an extractive institution would be a situation where the elites are taking the resource, the money, the outcomes from the common folk. So an inclusive institution would be a pluralistic political system, or, for example, a trading or share trading institution where you can put money in and get returns, while an extractive would be something like a feudalistic slavery-like situation, right? To an extreme, but there are softer versions of that as well. And obviously a country can have a mix of both, right? And the question is, what is more prominent or dominant, and what are the institutions that will drive the change, right? So obviously many countries have a mix of these institutions, and during large economic, social events in history, like the Black Plague or the French Revolution or some other stuff, each and one of the countries took a different turn based on the institutions that they had. Some of them got out really well, while others not so well. And the authors argue that this is all because how their institutions were built, right? So that's kind of like the main point of the book. There are some really interesting points that I'll discuss later on, but I'll let you talk about.
Can I ask one question before I dive in? What do we mean by institutions?
Sure.
What does that even mean?
Institution can be any system, any social or economic system within the country. So institution could be a political institution such as voting laws. It could be an economic institution such as the idea that you can invest money into the share market. It could be things like you can take your own produce into the markets. Anything that essentially allows someone to gain benefits from his or her work. That's kind of it.
Cool. Yeah, so interesting that we're putting these 2 books together. They both have nations in the title, right? The book that I wanted to cover kind of as a parallel to yours was...
That's the only reason.
The only reason is because it contains why nations succeed and fail. So there you go. I got both the up and the down on what you had. Ray Dalio, who's this famous hedge fund investor in Bridgewater, now that he's getting close to retirement, or he's already retired, I'm not sure, is really spending a lot of his time in putting down his principles of life and his understanding of the great pieces and how they fit together in the world. So he spent a lot of time studying history, he says, well, basically understanding the rise and fall of empires, from the Roman Empire to the Dutch, British, and American, and now kind of the emergence of China. As a caveat, he's got a lot of investments in China himself. A footnote there, which is important. So I think his really preoccupation, because he's obviously a money guy, he looks at things a lot through monetary policy. So the book was written with an attempt at kind of a call to action to begin with. The call to action being, hey, we live in a very inflationary environment. We're printing a lot of money. We're living in zero interest rate world. This was right before, as you can see today, the Fed is raising interest rates aggressively. And it's challenging, if you remember, speaking of our economic times, economic studies, challenging that modern monetary theory that says you can just print forever, because there's always going to be someone buying you'll always be able to generate more and more supply without affecting your economy. And he basically states that, no, you can't print forever. This will generate inflation at some point. And it won't generate inflation because of you as a country, but because of the status of reserve currency that, say, the US dollar has today, which was very similar to what the British pound had in the past, or the Dutch guilder. And at some point, your partners, so to speak, the rest of the world who's holding that currency as a store of value, will stop doing that. And it's actually this is why it's interesting, right? Because it kind of takes slightly different perspective to the book you're pointing out about institutions, which are the internal mechanisms, so to speak. And I'd like to challenge that a little bit as well later. Here's more talking about the behavior of a state, a great power in particular, so the most successful of nations, who goes through cycles, who basically develops, I think security comes first, and military technology, right? Whether it was ships back in the day, or nuclear weapons today, or something else, huge infantry such as China, I don't know, something else. Then on the back of it, you establish these economic ties, and you're able to globalize your trade and generate a lot of value out of that. Ultimately, this leads to your partners, because they need to engage in economic activities with you using your currency as the means of exchange. And that soon becomes a store of value. I was pointing out earlier, like, obviously we know we trade all commodities in dollars, especially oil. And then that also becomes a store of value for, say, the likes of China, who own trillions of dollars of that asset. What's happening right now is kind of the de-dollarization to some extent of the emerging countries, as the US has printed trillions and trillions more, kind of taking advantage of their status as reserve currency. So it's a cautionary tale of doing that, claiming that previous empires have gone through that behavior, and that resulted in their downfall ultimately. I think we can spend some more time on cause and effect around this later on. Is that helpful as a introduction into the book?
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess, would you describe this guy as a big US dollar fan, like a big advocate for the US dollar?
Sorry, just sharing a glimpse of our first fan in the back, Bella from Podgorica, Montenegro.
Oh, yeah, there she is. Hello.
Bella, hello.
Hello, Montenegro. How are you doing?
She's brown. It's not a
she's not interested in monetary policy.
No, but she's looking at you, so that's interesting.
So I guess, would you describe this guy as a big US dollar fan?
I mean,
big advocate
he's
for US
definitely
dollars.
aware of the advantages that a strong currency provides, kind of the leading power in the world. And that's always been the case, he argues, with all great powers. I mean, when the Dutch became the masters of the sea before the Brits in the 1600s, the guilder was the reserve currency for everything they were doing. And that provides amazing advantages because it allows for economic expansion very quickly. You're able to, effectively, when you print, you just have more money of it. And what it allows you to do is just buy more resources, say from your partners and so on, right, at a kind of a low cost. Then you catch up with economic activity. The problems come when there's a huge disconnect between the two, when you're kind of printing, but you're yet unable to generate that real economic output out of that printing of money. And there are extreme examples of kind of the Bitcoin bubble being clearly a symptom of printing. I mean, people argue maybe that's not the case, but I think in general, all crypto, the way we've seen them fall now with the tapering, right, and the interest rate increase, is that you had a lot of excess money, monetary mass, and that's just been taken out of the system. And the first to fall were the most speculative things. The same way with that's the classic story in the Netherlands. when the tulip mania started, right? And the tulip was seen as the bubble, right? The bubble of the tulips, where people were paying
It's a bubble.
astronomical, yeah. But
Bubble.
part of the reason for that is that people had a lot of excess cash available, right? There was a lot of liquidity in the system, and they didn't know what to put it in. So that's a symptom of as well as.
So you're arguing that you can avoid the bubbles by not giving people money, basically.
You could,
not giving them as much
I,
as they need.
What I think we've seen in the last few years is that the leaders of the Western world decided that it's worthwhile playing the game of printing a lot more and dealing with the consequences later of tapering rather than the other way around. So there's a huge grab, effectively, of resources. You would argue, other parts of the world argue, and that has been extremely beneficial for U.S. and its allies, and even the European Bank, and printing, because you just have so much more that you can then use to acquire real assets. However, in the long run, it leads to a lack of trust in the currency by the rest of the world, and it's a very tricky game. And once you lose the hegemony of your currency, so people stop trusting it and stop doing business in it, unless you have the military means to coerce them to maintain it, which, I mean, let's be honest, the US is very good at.
Hit you in the head if you don't like it.
Exactly. Then because it's a means of extracting value out of the rest of the world. At least that's what I learned in France when I was studying the IMF, and the French are very critical of the role of IMF and World Bank and so on in emerging countries. Anyway, so when that stops happening, you have a serious problem with too much liquidity, and that's what we're seeing a little bit today, and that's why everybody's in a rush to reduce the money supply effectively, which is actually affecting the real economy now.
I'm not surprised that the French are critical of everything outside France, so I don't consider that an important factor.
It was just a lecture when they were not striking, when they were not barricading themselves inside the university.
I'm just jabbing towards the French, because who doesn't want that? So, because it does sound like he assumes you need to have some sort of financial infrastructure. Like, you're really analyzing countries based on their financial infrastructure and how it handled growth and fall, essentially, right? Through money lending, that sort of stuff.
I mean, and I can jump into kind of some criticism of that, right? Because, and maybe criticism of your book as well, because the world...
Wait, not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. Let's go through my questions.
Yeah,
first,
sure.
And then we'll go through stuff.
I'll try to answer. I'm just an amateur in this.
You're too excited.
I changed my coffee machine.
Very excited economist.
I just changed my coffee machine. I'm getting some real caffeine.
Good. Before that, you weren't getting real coffee?
Just wasn't getting the right hit. It was this DeLonghi plasticky thing.
Wasn't getting the right amount.
No, it's just brown water.
The plastic revolution.
Mechanized. I've got a German.
Well, sometimes brown water can be nice. Okay. Let's focus on economics, our passion, what we are really excited about. So it does, to me, it does sound like it focused a lot on the financial infrastructure, as well as especially on the China versus US situation. Although I only read a summary all about China and the US and how, their situation and their balance is so fragile and could be flipped over, essentially. That's what it sounded to me. Otherwise, the book itself, at least the summary, sounded a lot like the hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times situation, right? It's almost like it described the 3 cycles, right? It was like, on top of my head, I can't recall exactly what the name of the cycles were, but it sounded like, as cycles move forwards, you will start encountering difficulties, and then you fall into a slump, but then you can get out of it if everything works well. Is that a fair assessment, or what do you think?
That is a virtuous cycle. That's why it's very hard to draw linear cause and effect relationships, and that applies to social sciences in general, right? You do this part well, which is you have real hegemony, you have real superiority in some aspects, whether it's kind of trade, infrastructure, which money relates to, right? Or military, and you need kind of both, maybe some good institutions that you're pointing out in your book, and that creates a snowball effect. The problem with these things, and maybe this is kind of a Nassim Taleb idea, is that when things screw up, they really screw up. So it's not like you just decelerate a little bit. Like if you've lost hegemony at one point, things can very quickly snowball down. That's why, in this case, you're left with a lot of money lying around, but you don't have the economic power anymore. Huge inflation and things, you lose control of the system because it's all dynamic. It's not just smooth curves, as much as Ray would like to sort of depicted in his cover of the book.
It's like a sparring in boxing,
Yeah. And,
Sure. That makes sense. And I guess my last question about this is, it does seem to focus a lot on like empires, as you use that word empires, I believe, like the US, China, and Russia. I wonder, does it have any focus or mention anything around like neutral countries like Switzerland and Norway, countries that are small and not necessarily treated as currency reserves?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Less so. So maybe that's where your book is more relevant, right? Because these systems are very complex. I can just hypothesize here. I don't think that's the case. It's really focused on great powers. I totally agree. And the interaction between great powers. But maybe we can think of them as pivots, right? Because any great power has a system of allies, right? And that's the case today. And to the extent to which, say, Switzerland is successful is that it's able to maintain a certain balance between great powers, and always has, right? You can Russians, Chinese people, Americans put their money in Switzerland, right? Regardless of the competition of the day, even Nazis or whatever we've heard, conspiracies from the past.
Every country had its time.
So that's important. And then basically, this kind of, and I think that's an interesting insight when we start putting the two books together, that you need, some people argue, I've heard, that you need a large power, right, that creates kind of a whole ecosystem around it. And then prosperity emerges as a result of that security, right? Stability. If everybody's fighting all the time, you're not going to have, you're going to spend so much time on war, and it's going to be so much, you can't build economically, you can't build institutions because everything's so unstable, right? And the great periods of prosperity in the world have been periods where there's been a certain balance with empires around them, right? The Pax Romana and so on, right? And then obviously within the Roman Empire, you had areas of prosperity, I'd assume, right? With great trading happening, right? Because of that peace.
Yeah, I guess so. Like the Roman Empire has been a very long time ago. Forgive me if I don't remember how life was there.
I forgive you.
I'm not as old yet, but thank you. So I think in some ways these two books are complementary. One of the first notes I read about the Ray Dalio book is that a country gains power when it encounters favorable economic and social conditions that enable the development of its economy and military. And that's kind of like the first line I saw from the book. And I thought, well, Why Nations Fail literally just talks about that. And that's it. That's everything it talks about. It doesn't get
It has some assumptions. It has exactly those assumptions as axioms right around it. First, you need the security, or at least someone is not bothering you, or someone's really protecting you, right? Providing you that security, or you're strong enough, right, to be able to build institutions on top of that.
Due to issues with recording, we'll wrap up. It sounds like our two books actually cover everything that's economics. And if you want to know everything about economics, you just have to read both books. So if you're interested in any of these books, please buy it following the link that we provide. And thank you for tuning in.